Hello, everyone, and welcome to this evening's webinar entitled Reporting on Palestine Behind the Headlines, hosted by the Palestinian Return Center. This event is an online panel discussion between Palestinian journalists from Palestine and around the world, discussing Palestine's major headlines in 2020 and 2021 so far, the headlines that didn't garner as much attention as they should have, and the struggles Palestinian journalists face. And I'd also like to take a moment to introduce the My Return campaign, which is a popular voluntary initiative launched by the London-based Palestinian Return Center, or the PRC, in cooperation with national and international pro-Palestine partners. The campaign was first launched in Jordan in cooperation with the Palestine Committee in the Jordanian Parliament. The campaign culminates in a petition that calls for and reaffirms the Palestinian right of return. The campaign seeks to turn such an inalienable right into an international cause. The campaign seeks to garner the largest possible number of signatures on a petition on their website, confirming Palestinian refugees' devotion to their right of return. The petition clearly states that it rejects the U.S. deal of the century and any other initiative undermining Palestinians' internationally guaranteed rights. Israel and the U.S. have never ceased to undermine such an inalienable Palestinian right by denying the refugee status of displaced Palestinians inside and outside occupied Palestine. The US President Donald Trump's recognition of occupied Jerusalem as Israel's undivided capital, the campaign waged by Israel and the US against UNRWA, the US suspension of its funding to Palestinian refugees, and the increasing calls to resettle the refugees in destinations other than Palestine are tactics which, though seemingly divergent, aim for the same goal, undermining the right of return. The right of return will never be negotiated away, nor will it be used as a bargaining chip. And this campaign is based on individual signatures on the My Return petition through its official website, www.myreturn.net. The petition has already garnered over 600,000 plus signatures. So please, if you have a moment, take a moment to sign now. And before we introduce our speakers, I would like to mention, if you do have any comments or questions that you would like to ask our speakers, please do leave them in the comments section below, and the speakers will answer them in the Q&A at the end. And now to introduce our first speaker, we have coming up first, Diana Algul. She's a British Palestinian journalist who holds an MA in International Conflict Studies from King's College London. Her areas of interest are Palestine, Israel, Yemen, and women's rights across the Middle East, North Africa region, and the rest of the world. She blogs about spirituality and plant-based living on www.dianaalghoul.com. Take it away.
Hello, everybody. So my name's Diana, and when we're talking about unrepresented stories in Palestine, there is something that is very close to my heart, because as a Palestinian, I believe that Palestine can never truly be free unless its women are free. So in August 2019, Isra Ghraib, a Palestinian girl she was 21, from Bethlehem, was honor killed by her father and allegedly her brothers because she took a photo with her fiance and his sister without them yet being married. I wrote about the story when it first garnered attention on Arab social media. I spoke to my contacts in Palestine, and I ended up just writing a piece and talking about how exactly this talks about, or this shows, the structural misogyny within our communities, which we love so much still, and we are a part of as women and as Palestinians. And that went viral. It garnered worldwide attention. I was not expecting that to happen at all. I didn't really think anybody would care. And with that, there were protests inside the West Bank, and there were also some changes, especially because of the international outrage at Isra Ghraib's tragic murder. With that also came a lot of criticism. Being a Palestinian, being a woman, being somebody who is a strong anti-Zionist and somebody who spent her whole career, and even before becoming a journalist, I was very active with Palestine. I was very much somebody who had always loved her country and had always loved to just showcase my culture and help people understand my cause. Um, so with that also came a lot of criticisms and people saying stuff along the lines of "Shame on you, Diana," or "Okay, good for you. You wrote this article. You discussed an important issue, but now look, the Israeli press has picked up on it," or we have people just criticizing us, or people have this image of Palestinians now as these hyper misogynists, or just stuff that really made, basically saying that me doing what I did, which was defending Palestinian women and also writing about this really tragic case and bringing it forward to the rest of the world, because English is one of the most understood languages in the whole world, was something that was wrong, because it was something that should have continued, but should have been a discussion to happen inside Palestine with Palestinians in the Arabic language. And with that, I did feel a bit conflicted, um, because when I did see the Israeli press pick up on it and really just misconstrued it in a way to say that this is why Palestinians do not deserve rights, or this is why Palestinians are, this is how all Palestinians are like, or if there was a one state solution, there would be no honor killings, because Israel, in its alleged secularism, means that this would not be tolerated anywhere, which we all know is not true, because honor killings happen everywhere in the world and Israel is nowhere near secular. Um, what that did was it just made me realize that a lot of the times, as Palestinians and as women, there are times in which we have to decide, do we want to be more Palestinian or do we want to be more woman? And this is a debate that, speaking to other Palestinian journalists and speaking to many who have been in similar predicaments to myself, it's something that we do not give enough attention to, because we as Palestinians, number one, we need a proper strategy when it comes to dealing with our women's rights issue. And that does not by any way or any stretch mean that we ignore it. We speak about it. We speak about it in Arabic. We speak about it in English. We speak about it in French. We speak about it in every single language, because a woman's life is a woman's life. And a Palestinian life is a Palestinian life. And just because there is a problem when it comes to hypermisogyny within our communities, that does not mean that we don't deserve our right to freedom, or our right to return, or our right to self-determination. It just means that there is a problem, that Palestinian women are being oppressed by Zionism and by misogyny. And this is something that we really need to take home and really need to stop shying away from. When the coronavirus pandemic first started, I looked into women's shelters in Palestine and how they've been doing, especially because of lockdowns meant that a lot of women weren't able to leave their houses when they were being abused. It meant that as schools were shutting, there were girls whose education was stifled, because they had to kind of like juggle between housework and their actual education. But these are the, I guess, the situation when it comes to the girls and the domestic duties and stuff, that's something that is completely universal. But when it came to the women's shelters, I went and I wrote about it, and again it garnered more attention and people saying it didn't go as viral as Isra Gharaib, but I did have the exact same criticisms, that why is it, as a Palestinian woman, you are, you're allowing you're allowing Israel, or you're allowing the Israeli press, you're giving them bait to criticize us, or to allow us to fit their trope of barbaric and all these Orientalist stereotypes about Arabs, about Muslims, especially about Palestinians. And my answer to that is, it's an issue that just because it's something that we have to deal with and there are consequences to it, it doesn't mean we should stop it. It doesn't mean that women should have to silence themselves out of fear of disrupting the harmony of the cause, when women's rights should be central, and women should be allowed to speak up and to allow our society to grow and to develop, and for us to just be able to say what we want, wear what we want, feel like it's safe for us to escape from abusive situations, and do that whilst campaigning and whilst pushing for statehood and whilst pushing for our liberation. And it's something that, as a Palestinian, we need to realize that we need to look into, what do we want a free Palestine to look like? Do we want a free Palestine to be a patriarchal Palestine? Do we want a free Palestine to be one that's just free for the sake of being free? Or do we want one that is free and equal to every single one of its citizens, whether they're from the West Bank, whether they're from the 48 territories, whether they are refugees, whether they've been exiled for generations, such as my own family, whether they're men, whether they're women, whether they're transgender, whether they're Muslim or Christian or gay or straight or any of that? How do we want Palestinians to live? And that does not mean that we are stalling the cause. We are absolutely not stalling the cause. We are having conversations that we need to have, because we cannot allow people to suffer on top of more suffering. And to not have these discussions means that people are being doubly or triply oppressed, because we've got the base, which is the base of Israel's occupation. We've got the base of the siege. We've got the base of not being able to come back to your homeland because you're politically exiled, or because you are an activist and you live in the West, or for any other reason. There is always a reason behind the Palestinian oppression that stems from the Zionist ideology. But there are other layers, and just as how we remember as Palestinians that we are Palestinian and we have a cause and we have something that we need to give, and a responsibility to protect our homeland and to protect our people, we also have a duty to ourselves as citizens of the world, and as women, and as any other sort of anything else that we identify with. And one thing we also need to ask ourselves, when we are talking about women's rights and when we're talking about Palestine, we need to ask, do we want a free Palestine, or do we want a man's Palestine?
Wow, that was an amazing speech, Diana. I think that definitely speaks to, here we see a lot of, interconnectedness with, I think we were at like a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests of Black and Palestinian solidarity, that there also would be the need to also bring in women's liberation and gay liberation to that struggle as well. I think that's sort of what you're hitting at too, and I think that was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for what you delivered. Um, Next, after Diana, I'd like to introduce Mr. Daoud Kuttab. He's a Palestinian journalist and media activist. He's the former Ferris Professor of Journalism at Princeton University. Daoud Kuttab is currently the Director General of Community Media Network, CMN, a not-for-profit media organization dedicated to advancing independent media in the Arab region. CMN is registered in Jordan and Palestine and administers Radio Al-Balad in Amman. Kuttab was elected as the deputy chair of the Vienna-based International Press Institute. He's a regular columnist with the Washington, D.C.-based Al Monitor and a Middle East reporter with Arab News. He's a frequent contributor to the Washington Post, the Middle East Institute, Project Syndicate, and other publications. He's the author of Sesame Street, Palestine by Bear Manor Publishing. And without further ado, take it away, Mr. Kuttab.
Thank you, Joshua. I have a long speech prepared, but Diana really did take us on an important area, and I actually would like to, I don't know if she can hear me, but I would like to address some of the points that she said, and then I can maybe talk about what I wanted to say. And that is that I totally understand exactly where she is, and I really applaud her and, tip my hat to her, because I think there is a misunderstanding that all Palestinians must be the same, all Palestinians must carry the same position, and everybody should be united in a way that actually allows for some issues to be buried just because they're not the top existential issues. It's clear that as Palestinians we should give predominance and priority to the national existential issues, but this should never be at the account of women's rights. And it actually reminded me of what happened to me almost 25 years ago when I published and broadcast issues about corruption in the Palestinian Authority, and I was jailed for that. And people told me exactly what people are telling her, that you should talk about corruption. That's not important now. We should only talk about the occupation, which is true. But I think you can have a fight for Palestine and fight for equality for women and men and for all people at the same time. So I just wanted to applaud her and say that don't worry and don't listen to people who are critical, because you will always have somebody critical of everything. So just do whatever you think is right. And Palestine is a big net and tent that can take all kinds of people, including people that maybe some people don't agree with all the time, and maybe it's not the majority opinion, but certainly it is absolutely her right and the rights of all of us to talk about issues like women's rights, like the right of women on her own body in her own life, like issues of corruption and so on. So just to say thank you, Diana, don't worry, and do whatever you feel is important. In fact, what Diana said actually does dive into what I wanted to talk about, which is that for us to succeed, especially in journalism and reporting about Palestine, we need to be genuine. And what I liked about what Diana was saying is that she was really passionate and genuine about what she was talking about. And I think people want today's world, with so much fake news and so much spin in media, to see and to hear people who are genuine, who are passionate about what they believe in, who are willing to fight, and even to be vulnerable. I mean, it is true that when you take on controversial issues, that you become vulnerable. But actually, on the other end, this is what gives you credibility. If you talk to somebody and you share your own life and your own mistakes and your own inequalities and problems you have, it actually makes you much more human. It shows that you are genuine and human. And I think what is missing often in many people trying to cover Palestine is that they try to hide their humanity. They try to talk, often even exaggerating. I mean, as if occupation is not bad enough, they have to kind of exaggerate things. And the other side easily can grab exaggerated mistake and make a big deal about it. So I like her passion, and I like the personality, and I like the vulnerability that she is willing to sacrifice in order to get issues that she's passionate about. So I applaud her, and those of you watching, that be yourself, be honest, and let things be what they are. You might not be in the New York Times tomorrow, but still continue to be who you are, and sooner or later people will trust you and respect you for being genuine. Now, in reporting about Palestine, I find a number of mistakes that I wish we can find ways to resolve. and one of them is the absence of humanizing the Palestinian cause. You know, we talk so much about numbers, about theories, about, you know, big issues of apartheid and occupation and oppression, and we forget about the human element. And I often try to do, I don't always succeed, in when I write and when I try to do anything, I try to bring in a human story, bring in somebody's life, brings in how the big issues are actually affecting life. We call it contextualization or humanizing the Palestinian cause. And I think there are so many human interest stories that are just hidden or not being seen, that I think if we can shed the light on them and highlight them, we can do much better in the way we deal with the media. Now, I think also people need to understand that if you want to report on Palestine, there are certain things you need to do. You need to do your homework. Number one is, if you want to really report on Palestine and if you want to reach a wide audience, you need to do your homework, which means if you want to write for any particular publication, you need to study that publication. What is its line? What is the audience? What is their editorial policy? What do they take? You know, if they take 700 words, don't send them 10,000 words. It just wouldn't work. If they take only opinions and try to write in opinions, try to understand what makes an opinion publishable. Read their stuff. Read what they write. Follow their website. Follow their news. See how they approach issues that are controversial, and then you can take a particular point of view and stand. So my first issue is really understand, do your homework, study the media that you want to write or publish or broadcast in, and then don't give up your passion, don't give up your principles, but you can do a lot without doing that. I mean, sometimes you have to avoid certain things. You should never say things you don't believe in, but maybe sometimes you need to avoid. You know, if you're writing for a German paper, you know, don't mention Nazism, or, you know, if you're writing for a paper that, let's say an Israeli paper, don't fill your text with direct attacks against Israelis, because you're offending them. So find a way to express yourself. Don't say things you don't believe in, but you can avoid things that will bring you a rejection to your ideas. So I think we should try to find that equilibrium between being honest and truthful and telling what we really think, versus having to basically capitulate and become part of the enemy's lexicons and so on. So that's something that is very important. Avoid rhetoric. There's enough human interest stories. There's enough facts in the Palestinian cause. There's enough justice to be served and to be fought for, that there is no need to get involved in rhetorical arguments that really do not bring the cause any good. I mean, try to avoid using language that might turn off people. You want to reach people. You want to convince them of your point of view. And yes, you don't want to call it the Israeli Defense Forces, but again, you don't have to say Israeli Offensive Forces. You could just say Israeli Army, or find ways to get your ideas across without upsetting your readers. Because look for the big goal. What's the big goal? We want to get our message across. There is a fight for our narrative. The Palestinian narrative is being fought on so many levels. There's so many competing forces that are trying to spin and to explain the Palestinian narrative in the wrong way. So I think it's very important to be honest and to tell our opinions. Always look for new angles. Talk about culture, talk about cooking, talk about folklore, talk about, you can tell the Palestinian story and the history and the steadfastness of Palestinians without saying a political word, but you can actually say more national, you can be more pro-Palestinian without saying a political word than using all these big rhetorical words that might turn people off. Also, culture is a huge area that is, I mean, if you're writing an op-ed for New York Times, you're competing with 10,000 other op-eds. But if you're writing a cultural story, even for the New York Times, you have less competition. If it's a good story, if it has genuineness, if it has honesty, if it has a new angle of a cultural development, you'll find that you can get through much easier using that. Now, we also need to understand that not everyone in the world understands the Palestinian cause and understands the Palestinian history. And the other side is so good at spinning and creating false narratives. So sometimes you have to dumb down. You have to really be much more simple. You have to explain things over and over again. Maybe you have to say it in different ways, but don't talk over people's head. Come down to the level and speak to them. And I think when you humanize the Palestinian story, when you're honest and even vulnerable, I think people take you and trust you and believe you. And then you could really say whatever you want. But you really have to first win them over. And you have to throw the net, and not everybody's going to pick up on your ideas. But continue to do what you're doing, continue to do what you believe in, and stay committed to your cause, but try to take in the human element, try to take in the personal story, and I think you'll find that you will be very well received.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kuttab, for all the sagacity that you have, imparted upon us. I'll definitely be using some of your advice next time that I'm speaking about Palestine as well, and I really appreciate you for coming. So thank you so much. And so now we're going to our third speaker, Miss Nadeen Alshaer. She's a Palestinian news reporter and presenter who works with PBC and Radio Bethlehem 2000. As a reporter in the West Bank, Nadeen has covered ongoing Israeli occupation violations against the Palestinian people that Western mainstream media tends to either ignore or misreport. Her reports and stories shed a light on the realities the Palestinian people face. Nadeen has over 3 years' experience in the field. However, what is most important to her in her journalism is her cause and significance of showing the real Palestine in her professional work. And take it away, Nadeen.
Thank you, Joshua. So I'll just start by saying that I totally agree with Mr. Daoud Kuttab about humanizing your stories so it can attract more audience and reach international, local, and regional audience. So many stories and headlines turn to one basic subject. So recently, a mother of a child who was arrested by Israeli occupation forces had a stroke after Israeli occupation forces arrested her kid, who's only a kid. And the news struck her hard, and these stories would be covered in headlines such as a child has been arrested, and that's it. Most of the media outlets didn't cover the story of the mother, so the story hadn't been humanized and absolutely didn't reach and target more audience. Another story I'm about to mention is the ongoing settlers' attacks on Palestinians, especially on Saturday nights after their holiday. A lot of Israeli settlers go on streets between Palestinian cities and Palestinian villages. They attack Palestinians in their cars who are crossing between these places. Most of the stories and headlines would be like this: an Israeli group of settlers attacked a car of Palestinians, but no follow-up would be about the story. No media outlet would be talking about a specific person that has been attacked. The headlines are copy-pasted from one news outlet to another. I think this subject has been covered in 2020 and also 2021. It has garnered a lot of attention, but I don't think it has been humanized, as Mr. Kuttab mentioned, so it can target more audience. So this year, 2020, has been already very difficult for Palestinians due to COVID-19 and also to general issues that are happening in Palestine and the general situation, let's say. Israel's plan to place 1 million settlers in the West Bank is ongoing, with the expansion, also with the seizure of land by settlers, which is also another story that is not humanized. So when we're talking about settlers who seizure land, which is illegal and covered by Israeli policies and Israeli politicians such as Netanyahu and other ministers in his government, the story of the people whose land is being seized are not really covered or talked about in a humanizing way. So the repeated news and repeated headlines don't attract audience. They also don't attract let's say, more journalists to cover these stories, because every journalist is different than the other, and a lot of journalists here tend to cover stories and news reports in, let's say, a traditional way. So humanizing the story, especially when we're talking about a struggle of more than 70 years, so repeated stories, repeated headlines, and the same chronic response by, let's say, different sides. So we're now talking about Israel's plan to place 1 million settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. So the number that is not mentioned in, let's say, local, regional, and international media is that more than half of that number is already placed in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. We have 132 big settlements that are seizing land around them that are expanded settlements too. We're talking about 124 and more random settlement units in the West Bank and outposts that are also maintained by these settlers that are given the green light to do what they want to do. One reason is that the Israeli elections now are promoting more far-right policies, and the far-right parties in Israel are taking, let's say, the Knesset by storm right now, even though that they have the Arab representatives there. What's important to me as a journalist is to talk about this, is how Israel is moving forward with this plan and seizure land and expansion, to have people understand the dangers of getting used to hearing such news repeatedly, even for me as a journalist. I believe that subconsciously people are hearing this news and stories and not even looking into them. And since these news are being, and headlines are being displayed on daily basis. So we hear about self-demolishes in Jerusalem by Palestinians in Jerusalem, East Jerusalem in particular. And the stories would be covered as someone has demolished his own home since he doesn't want to pay for Israeli tractors and let's say I don't know what's called, the cars that demolish their homes. I'm sorry. So by these illegal Israeli laws in Jerusalem and West Bank, understand the numbers that we're talking about is actually very scary. According to the latest information provided by the Palestinian News and Information Agency, more than 560 people have been displaced from their homes. So we have a lot of stories, a lot of people with the same story. It's kind of hard for journalists and reporters in particular to cover these stories from different angles. We're talking about, so I'm talking about these stories as a reporter here in Palestine. We're always are met with these stories that seem to be the same. And the hard part is to find the different angle to cover these stories. So sometimes you spend many hours just going to that place, to the place of the event, and trying to find a different angle to cover the story, a new way and perspective for people to understand the human part of that story. So we are also met with the ultimate pretext of lack of Israeli permits, in which are impossible for Palestinians to obtain. So you have this side of the story from the Israelis. But as Palestinians, we find this illegal, and it's also illegal by international law. So you have many obstacles when you're covering the story, but the most important part is to find that different perspective, the new perspective, when you have similar stories repeated daily and covered by different media outlets. So you have this story, and you have another reporter and another reporter covering the same story about the same person whose house was demolished, and you have to find that different angle. It's not easy, it's hard, but it can be done. I'm still young in this profession, but just I look before I go to the field, I look at this story as a Palestinian, as a person who wants to know the real story behind what is happening, to understand and hear different perspectives, to see the story in a different angle, so I can actually feel it and feel genuine about it. So this is, as a journalist and a reporter, this is one of the hardest parts to do. Mr. Daoud Kuttab has a very long experience, and I'm still young, so his advices mean a lot to me right now when I'm just talking about the stories as a reporter in Palestine, facing these repeated headlines and stories met with different media outlets that are trying to be different than the others.
Thank you so much, Miss Alshaer. That was very thought-provoking. Like everything that you described, like how they do almost just repeat the same headlines almost, rather than, I think it does go back to what Mr. Kuttab said as well, to humanize these stories as well, to really create something new, to make people actually realize just the gravity of the frankly humanitarian catastrophe that is going on in historic Palestine. So thank you so much once again. I would like to call a 5-minute break so that we can prepare. We have our final speaker who needs actually a translator, and I'll introduce him after the break to give a little suspense, quite frankly, and help prepare. And we're going to play a song, and then we'll be back shortly.
geçse de ömrüm bitse de beni öldürse de döneceğim bekle Filistin. لو مرت أعوام لو سلبت أحلام لو كسرت أقلام حتما ستعود فلسطين. العودة حقي وقراري وكذاك طريق الأحرار في جيبي مفتاح الدار سأعود لأرض فلسطين. العودة حقي وقراري وكذاك طريق الأحرار في جيبي مفتاح الدار سأعود لأرض فلسطين. Seni unutup gitmem, sensiz hiç olmam. Sevdim sever seveceğim, döneceğim bekle Filistin. لو طال الأسر لو محي الفجر لو نفد الصبر حتما ستعود فلسطين. العودة حقي وقراري وكذاك طريق الأحرار في جيبي مفتاح الدار سأعود لأرض فلسطين. العودة حقي وقراري وكذاك طريق الأحرار في جيبي مفتاح الدار سأعود لأرض فلسطين. العودة حقي وقراري وكذاك طريق الأحرار في جيبي مفتاح الدار سأعود لأرض فلسطين. العودة حقي وقراري وكذاك طريق الأحرار في جيبي مفتاح الدار سأعود لأرض فلسطين.
Hello, all. Thank you so much. And now, as suspense has been appropriately built up, I'd like to introduce our fourth final journalist. And last and certainly not least, his name is Moath Amarnih, and he's a Palestinian photojournalist based in the occupied West Bank, who on the 15th of November 2019 lost sight in his left eye after being seriously injured by a rubber bullet fired by an Israeli soldier in the Sarif region of Hebron, where Amarnih was covering a protest against land confiscation. Journalists from across the Arab world launched a campaign of solidarity with him after Amarnih was hit in the eye. In a show of support, activists took photos of themselves covering an eye with one hand and posted them on social media using the hashtags MoathEye or Eye of Truth. And it's again my pleasure and honor to introduce the man of the hour, or rather the man of the next 10 to 12 minutes, Mr. Moath Amarnih. And also, I'll also introduce his translator as well, Mr. Ragad Altekriti. Oh. I would just like to announce, I don't know what it looks like on your guys' end, but we are having mild technical difficulties. It has come to my attention that Moath is having issues with his internet. So I do apologize for any issues with buffering or anything of that sort. Hey, yeah, um, we're having a bit of issues with Mr. Amarnih's internet. I do apologize. I do apologize. As I'm speaking with the tech crew, we are having issues with even getting Mr. Amarnih to speak. For which I do apologize. I would like to, however, direct you guys, now all of our journalists here, to be able to answer some question and answers. And I think it would be best if we're able to get everyone, on screen so that we can direct the question to each journalist and have them give a thorough answer. Because we do seem to have a bit of extra time, so. Yeah. The first question that we have posed to us is as follows. I'm just loading it on my phone real quick. If you had to pick one headline on Palestine that you have covered, that you found the most compelling and hardest to write, which would it be? And now I direct this question to all of our journalists, to Miss Algul, Mr. Kuttab, and to Miss Alshaer.
You want me to speak first? The headline that I would most be proud of is any headline that has to do with nonviolent protests and boycotts. I think what happened during the first Intifada has been so powerful that people refusing voluntarily to engage with the Israeli occupation was, I recovered the events in the town of Beit Sahur when people refused to pay their taxes. And I remember they all raised the sign that was used in America, no taxation without representation. And I thought that was a very smart way of telling a clear issue of people wanting to have self-determination and refusing to abide by the occupiers and their way of trying to control life. So yes, that would be my favorite headline, maybe.
And now, thank you so much. Now to Miss Algul.
So my favorite one is one that I wrote recently. Hamad al-Durra's father spoke out against the normalization. Sorry, is there something coming out of my laptop? التطبيع وهالاحتلال. Can you guys hear something? Okay, cool.
It was a translator we had.
Okay. Okay, I'll try to ignore. Sorry. So Muhammad. Oh no, this is coming from my laptop. I'm so sorry. From the article that I actually just pulled out. So Muhammad al-Durra's father, I think on the anniversary of the Second Intifada, spoke out against normalization normalization with Israel and said that the UAE is committing, trying to translate it from my head, but basically the UAE is, or the Emirati government is basically being a traitor to Palestine and Palestinians. And to me, that's very important because it just shows that the Palestinian cause just continues throughout the generations. It reminded me of the way in which so many Palestinians in the diaspora have stories of their parents and their grandparents, but also how parents have stories of their sons and daughters who have been martyred before their time.
That was a very, very moving answer. Thank you so much, Miss Alghoul. And now, last and certainly not least, I'd like to direct the question to Miss Alshaer.
Thank you, Joshua. I think one of the hardest headlines that I had to cover was any headline that talked about a murder, a Palestinian killed by Israeli forces, when you had to cover it in a humanitarian way, humanizing way. I think my favorite was of last year in 2020, Ahmed Ariqat's death was one of the hardest, but also one of the closest stories to my heart. It was during the peak of COVID-19, and he was killed on the day of his sister's wedding. It was one of the hardest, and also one of my favorites. It's tragic, but it's absolutely one of my favorites of the reports and stories I have done.
Yeah, and that I remember when that headline came out. That was horrendous. I think one of my friends who was wrote that something like about how the checkpoint was almost like designed to instigate, and I think that really said a lot. So thank you so much, all. And I'd like to direct, this question is directed to Mr. Kuttab, and the question is worded, Mr. Kuttab, do you think that the main reason for this is a systematic approach of the Israeli administration to decrease the role of Palestinian women in fighting for the freedom of their land and people? Oh, it appears you're muted. I'm having trouble hearing you, sir.
I'm not muting anything. Somebody muted me, but can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, I don't think that the problem that Diane spoke about is the direct fault of the Israelis. I think we sometimes overstate everything and blame it on the Israelis. I think we need to do our own internal kind of engagement and respecting each other, respecting humanity, respecting women's rights. And I don't think we need to put everything and blame everything on the Israelis in the occupation. I think on the women's issue, the Israelis, of course, they are not happy when Palestinians are building up their national unity and strengthening their internal fiber and then having people respect each other. They prefer to divide and rule. But on this issue, I think it is more of an internal issue that we need to find more respect for humanity and for each other than just to blame it on the Israelis.
I think I'd like to direct this question to Diana as well, because Diana helped break this very important story, or actually these two rather very, very important stories. Can hear you now.
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much to Mr. Daoud for everything that you said, and thank you so much for your support. And I completely respect 1,000% your struggles with the PLO and the corruption. My grandfather, Allah yarhamu, had something very similar. And to answer your question, I do partially agree that we can't just put the blame on Israel for everything, because we do have a systemic problem. But at the same time, we need to understand conditions and how conditions can exacerbate certain causes. So, for example, I interviewed somebody a few years ago, a Nakba survivor, and he said that he used to work on the agriculture, but at the same time he used to go to school because education was very important. Palestinians have a stereotype that we are amongst the most educated Arabs. In Kuwait, where my family escaped to, they have this thing where Palestinians are always smart, and they're so smart because of the amount of za'atar we eat. And when we look at the conditions of the occupation has unfortunately stifled education. It has forced younger boys to work instead of go to school, and it's forced younger girls to stay at home. And then when parents can't afford to send both of their children to, or both genders of their children to school, what they would do is they'd say, okay, I'm sorry, daughter, you have to stay at home, or you go to school. Even though within our culture, education is so important to the level in which people before the Nakba used to just go to study for the sake of studying and then spend the rest of their lives tending towards their beautiful land, which they absolutely adore. There is also the concept of divide and conquer, people having a lot of anger within them, and the mental health that comes from living under occupation, because again, we're talking about an occupation, we're not just talking about a land grab. Just like Daoud and Nadeen were talking about, they articulated it so beautifully when they said, we are humans as well. This occupation has psychological connotations and psychological implications. So yes, that would definitely create more anger and create more targets, and it would create more situations where, obviously this is not in any way me saying that it's a justification at all, but when somebody has been through checkpoints throughout his whole day and has probably had to work in a settlement, in a labor job, despite him studying, he comes home very frustrated, very angry, and would snap just like that at his wife and children. Not an excuse whatsoever. There's no excuse for violence, but it's also, we need to understand that there are conditions that create such anger and such frustration for it to be let out. So this is a very multi-layered question, and whilst we have a responsibility and we have a duty to our women and to our people and to the vulnerables in our society, we need to understand that, yeah, there can be links to the occupation as well.
That was all very well put, Diana. Thank you so much. It kind of reminds me, frankly, of like I'm pretty sure this is an old, like, goes back to Engels on the Holy Family. I think was what he wrote about how in modernity, as men would be these laborers, it would almost be like capitalism would be like, okay, you're subjugated in the workforce, but you can be a tyrant to your home. And I think that the occupation sort of exacerbates that dynamic. Absolutely. And that's what you're getting at. And is there anything that you'd like to add, Nadeen, to this?
Oh, sorry. Not really. I just agree with Diana and Mr. Kuttab about what they said.
Sounds good. And I just want I did get a message from the host, and I just want to clarify this. Moath Amarnih could not join because the internet and electricity is cutting off, and he lives in a refugee camp. So that I think was very important for us to know. And here's our next question. This is directed to all the speakers, and you all, I think, can answer this. To what extent could it be said that detaining and imprisoning Palestinian children in notorious and ever-expanding violation of international law and human rights is a systematic and designed method of suppressing civic participation in Palestinian youth?
Who's this? Who? All of us?
This is directed to all of you, so y'all can jump in essentially, whenever.
Well, I think that the issue of imprisoning children is a terrible crime. I mean, I think it's one of the worst things that leaves scars on human beings almost all their lives. The children are so affected by these imprisonments that it creates the anger and hatred that stays with them their whole life. So I think international conventions against child imprisonment are clear on this issue. There's no negotiations on it. It's very, very clear that this is a war crime and it should be dealt that way.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kuttab. And Diana, would you like to add anything to that?
Is it okay if Nadeen goes first because she was last?
Oh,
to give her
go for it. I'm sorry, Nadeen.
No,
Yeah.
Oh no, it's all right. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Joshua. I have to agree with Mr. Daoud, but I also like to mention that I think it is a must for Palestinian institutions also to work with Palestinian youth here. We're talking about the ages of 6 till maybe like advanced teenage years. So the psychological effect is somehow true when Mr. Kuttab mentioned that it does create a permanent hate towards the occupation, Israelis, and so on. But I also think that most of these kids that go to prison and are faced with these extreme conditions in prison with also people who are way younger, older than them in prison, who are actually representatives of different political parties. I think there should be NGOs, Palestinian NGOs, not international, but Palestinian, that should be taking care of these children, that should be guiding them in schools, in their daily lives. And I think it does not, or it should not be only with these children, but also with their families, because family plays a huge role in this issue.
Thank you so much, Nadeen. And Diana, is there anything that you would like to add to that?
I agree with both of what you said. And one thing I would also like to say, and with this I would like to kind of put on my more mindfulness hat on and say that when you imprison a child, especially when they are in their developmental stages, so many spiritual leaders have said that, and philosophies say that children are meant to play. So the Prophet Muhammad said that the first 7 years, peace be upon him, are for play. And there are so many other philosophies, ancient and modern philosophies, that say children do not need to use their mind. They need to foster emotional intelligence in order for them to grow and for them to nurture an environment where they can learn through curiosity for when they are ready to start learning and start exploring their mind with their emotional state being nurtured when they're younger. Then you just put them on a path to greatness. What you do when you imprison a child is you stop them from developing their emotional side. And what that means is you create, I guess, this level of a curse where they have such deep-seated issues. They may not remember what could have happened to them. They'll remember that they went to jail, but they may not remember every single detail or every single trauma, which would mean it will be very difficult for them to heal. And this will enter adulthood. This will continue if they haven't done the healing, especially with the lack of mental health services because of the occupation. This will just continue for generations because children learn from their parents. So this is actually setting a very dangerous precedent, not just for the child, but for future Palestinian generations.
Can I add something too? So as a Palestinian who was also a kid at some point, I remember that one time I was probably in I think 2nd or 3rd grade, and we used to walk to school and go back home. So the way that the street we were taking would be an Israeli-Palestinian one. So a main Israeli street that connects south, the West Bank with north. And I remember that I was 5 years old I was 7 years old when I first saw a bulldozer, an Israeli bulldozer with a sniper on top of it. So you're talking, Diana, about the psychological effect and the traumas that Palestinian kids experience. I find it funny because as a Palestinian who was a kid and also experienced these circumstances, I just really find it hard to find in myself where is the trauma that happened in the past and where is it now in the present, how it affected me in the present. Probably that made me go to journalism. But I'm not sure. I'm still trying to find how it might have psychologically affected me. And this goes also to a lot, thousands and hundreds of other Palestinian children who are now grown-ups.
This is actually why I do what I do, and I like to connect my healing and mindfulness work to my journalism, because I've seen this a lot with Palestinians who grew up inside of Palestine. Even though I've never been, I had to deal with my own traumas when it came to racism, especially when it came to trying to understand the Intifada, the second Intifada when I was a kid, and all sorts of things. And also just understanding the trauma of my parents and my grandparents. And I mean, if you do want some guidance on that, you're more than welcome to contact me. But it's, again, recognizing Palestine is so important because we can help each other.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hold on one second. Sorry about that. I'm just looking to see if we have any. Hold on one second. Hold on. I'm very sorry. I'm just gonna see if we have any more questions. Because I was asking people who were handling the tech of this event, and they didn't have any. But let me see if any have gone to our page, and asked a question there, perhaps, rather than directly. Let me see. Yeah. I'm sorry, we don't have any more questions. But I do think that, and Mr. Kuttab was making this point earlier. I do want to go back to it because I think that we see a lot of parallels in the modern day. You mentioned about the non-violent, Palestinian resistance of refusing to pay, taxes to the occupation. And I think that we're seeing, from my perspective, in the U.S., there's a lot of organizing for the BDS movement. It's seeming like a lot of this is becoming sort of the main thrust of how we achieve freedom for Palestine. So I guess I'd really like to ask you all what you think about BDS and journalism on the BDS movement.
Well, I think BDS is a great nonviolent way of bringing attention to the Israeli occupation. Unfortunately, again, the media issue is very important because the narrative that the other side has succeeded in waving is that this is an anti-Semitic movement and all that's baloney. But they are so successful at it that we need to really take them to task and explain that this is a First Amendment right, that people have a right to choose what they want, and they can choose to eat at their restaurant and not to eat, as the blacks during the civil rights movement did in America. And they chose not to ride the buses. They walked instead of riding the buses. This was a nonviolent act. And so BDS is a totally nonviolent movement. They do not take a position on the two-state solution or the one-state solution. But, so what? Even Trump one time said, I don't care if it's a two-state or one-state. So everybody has their own idea of what the final solution should be. But even regardless of the negotiated settlement, people have a right to wanting to end the occupation, and ending the occupation is the goal of the BDS, and I think it's a valid movement.
Yeah, and I think I'd like to point this both to you, Diana, and you, Nadeen, as well, about BDS, your thoughts on movement, and your thoughts on journalism and its flaws, or even its merits on the BDS movement.
I actually think BDS is where Palestinian journalists and solidarity activists got it right in many ways, because with BDS, the campaign has made it very clear that it's non-violent. It has made it very clear what the aims are, which is directly on the occupation. And when it comes to the fact that it's so ambiguous as to whether it's two-state or one-state, I actually agree with that, because at least what that does is it creates an aim and it takes away the discussion, because even though the discussion needs to be had, do we go for two states, do we go for one state, for all, it's a discussion that is very long-winding and can sometimes distract from a particular aim, which is to boycott and divest and sanction, and boom, let's get this done. As for the way the Israeli press has been very, very, very good at making sure that they propagate it as something anti-Semitic, it's evidently not, and those are very weak arguments, but they're weak arguments that are said over and over and over again. And their main strength is repetition, and also the fact that there are many politicians that are able to go behind this repetition to advance this discourse. So with us, I think it's just a matter of continuing the repetition from our end, but also answering more questions and being open and actually being more critical, rather than they're saying it's anti-Semitic. No, it's not, which doesn't always happen, because Palestinians are very good at showing why BDS is not anti-Semitic. But it's just a matter of just continuing to go on, because any form of activism, even if it's non-violent, can be seen as violent by the violent oppressor. It's just a natural part of gaslighting and Israel's continued way of demeaning the Palestinian cause.
Very, very well said, Diana. And Nadeen, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I have actually a question for Mr. Kuttab about the BDS. So the BDS is met with anti-Semitic statements from U.S. And let's say European and Israeli politicians. The Canary Mission is working against advocates of the BDS in different U.S. universities, especially in NYU, and one of the advocates is Nadeen. I'm not sure if you've heard about her, but she's been in the news recently, and she has been getting death threats from the Jewish institutions and Israeli people, Jewish people too. She has been the target of the Canary Mission, and a lot of false information have been published about her. So what is a way to face such missions that target BDS advocates that are met with anti-Semitic accusations?
And courage and the persistence and staying on score, not changing and not giving in to the intimidation, and doing what you think is right. I don't think there's any magic solution. I think you need to stay on course and stay courageous and do what you believe is right, and people eventually will fall away, because truth always wins. So it might take a longer time, but truth will win.
Yeah, I think that was all very well said. Thank you so much, everyone. I do actually have a couple more questions. One did just get sent to us. And this I think is pretty interesting. This is directed to all of you. Is there any unhelpful way of reporting from international journalism that you advise against producing? And this is to all of you, so I'll have at it, Haas.
You want to start?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, there's many things we would like the international journalists not to overstate. For example, they overstate Palestinian prisoners, support for prisoners. Any society in the world gives its own heroes social support. So they overplay this, what they call pay for slay, which is totally Israeli propaganda. I mean, Israel itself pays the killer of Rabin and his family social support services. So every community in the world honors its heroes, and the prisoners and the martyrs in our society are heroes. So you can say whatever you want, do whatever you want. Palestinians will never give up respecting those who sacrifice their lives and their health to be in jail or to lose their lives. So, I think it's a red herring that the international media falls for the trap that is set up by the Israelis, and they write about it in a way as if it is a serious issue. It's not a serious issue.
All right. And you, Diana, what would you like to say about this matter?
I'd say that, I guess, coming from a newsroom, normal practice of newsroom journalism is to go to wire stories. When you publish a wire story, read it. Something that a lot of people do is when they get context, they tend to get context from a wire or a source that says it's neutral. Actually go to news agencies and go to Palestinian sources, because you will also find quotes. You'll find stuff from the Palestinian government that has been said, statements, and you will find many people to connect with in English and in Arabic, and it becomes very easy. It takes like 15 minutes extra to do, but your news story will have a lot more depth, and it will just have a lot more, it'll have more voices from the local.
Very, very much appreciate insight as well. And Nadeen, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I would actually like to add that international media outlets should be equal when it comes to covering stories here in Palestine and Israel, especially the features, stories of the people themselves. Most of the international media, especially the Western one, are one-sided. Their offices here are in Jerusalem or in Tel Aviv. They're not exposed. Their cameramen, their reporters, their producers are not exposed to Palestinians. They work in Jerusalem, in Israel with Israelis, with Palestinians who speak Hebrew, but they're not exposed to the reality here. So that's probably why their coverage is one-sided most of the time, but it should be equal. I mean, true that most of these offices are in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv because Israel is recognized as a country, and most of them are like the BBC is a national TV. So yeah, if I would like to advise any international media outlet is to have equal coverage of any story.
Thank you
I
so
can
much.
add one more thing, Joshua. I think what Diana said was important, that people are the best experts on their lives. What I don't like about international media is that they have Americans, Europeans, and Israelis represent the Palestinians. And this is totally unaccepted. Nobody would ever represent the African Americans with the white guy, you know? We speak languages, we can express ourselves. There is no reason why, if you want the Palestinian point of view, you don't speak to a Palestinian. It should never be allowed. Now, if you want to talk about Israeli opinion, fine, right, left, and center. But if you want the Palestinian opinion, don't quote an Israeli telling us what Palestinians think. That's really pathetic, paternalistic, and it's totally unacceptable.
Agreed entirely, and you all have been the best of guests. I want to just reiterate your names again for anyone who maybe be dropping in last minute. We have Daoud Kuttab, we have Alghoul, we have Nadeen Alshaer. Thank you so much, all of you. I'm told we have to wrap it up. And frankly, in an era where the New York Times and the Washington Post have not at all even touched the B'Tselem report regarding Israel being an apartheid regime that rules from the Jordan to the Mediterranean, having actual Palestinian journalists be able to give insightful and incisive media critiques and their own media stories as well, like you all, is an absolute honor. And inshallah, people will be listening to you and your sagacity, all of you. Thank you so much. Have a great one.
Bye. Thank you.
Right.
Yıllar geçse de ömrüm bitse de beni öldürse de döneceğim bekle Filistin. لو مرت أعوام لو سلبت أحلام لو كسرت أقلام حتما ستعود فلسطين. العودة حقي وقراري وكذاك طريق الأحرار في جيبي مفتاح الدار سأعود لأرض فلسطين. العودة حقي وقراري وكذاك طريق الأحرار في جيبي مفتاح الدار سأعود لأرض فلسطين. Seni unutup gitmem, sensiz hiç olmam. Sevdim sever seveceğim, döneceğim bekle Filistin. لو طال الأسر لو محي الفجر لو نفد الصبر حتما ستعود فلسطين.